Hello, and welcome to the latest episode in Emory University's Health Storytelling Project, a Q&A with authors of fascinating new books about health and science. I'm Maryn McKenna. I'm a journalist and author and senior fellow in the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University, and I'm the curator and host of this series. In a moment, I'll introduce you to my guest, journalist and athlete Christine Yu, and her fascinating book, Up to Speed, the groundbreaking science of women athletes. But first, let me tell you about this series. At least once per month during the academic year, we invite writers whose journalistic or academic books examine health, the science and history of health, and health's intersection with society. This series of conversations originates at the Emory Center for the Study of Human Health. We're also fortunate to have three amazing co-sponsors: the Georgia Center for the Book, an affiliate of the Library of Congress; Science Gallery Atlanta, which presents exhibits that live at the juncture of science and art and ignite creativity and discovery; and the much-loved Decatur Book Festival, the largest independent book fair in the United States. Book fans may know that the festival has been taking a post-pandemic hiatus here to rethink its goals and strategies, and in that pause, we have been delighted to bring these authors in our series to the festival's passionate supporters. The festival has just announced that it will return to live production this year in October 2024, and we are very excited to have them back. So if you're coming to us from one of those co-sponsors, please let us know in the comments. This episode marks the last of our spring season, so let me tell you who's appeared so far. Our theme in this half year has been how our health is determined by forces and systems beyond our control, whether that's the built environment or the legal system, changes in weather and climate, or research agendas that choose what is and is not studied, and how we negotiate those systems to protect our health, or how we don't. In January, I spoke to investigative journalist Jessie Singer about her book, There Are No Accidents: The Deadly Rise of Injury and Disaster, Who Profits and Who Pays the Price, published by Simon & Schuster. In February, my guest was medical anthropologist Teresa McPhail and her book, Allergic: Our Irritated Bodies in a Changing World. And tonight, I'll be speaking to journalist Christine Yu about Up to Speed, the groundbreaking science of women athletes, which was published by Riverhead Books, part of Penguin Random House. This series is live streamed on YouTube, Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and LinkedIn, and archived on YouTube. We're also now streaming live to Instagram for the first time. One final note: if you're watching us on the 3rd of April, you are experiencing a live event. You can interact with us by commenting on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, or replying to our account on Twitter, X. If you do, our producer, Stefan Kaplan of Spin It Social, will make sure we see what you've said, and will put your question up on screen when I pose it to our guest. We're still working on comment integration for Instagram. If you're watching there, we'll get better. Do note that I'll turn to your questions in the second half of this 60-minute live stream, but you can put your questions into the chat boxes or into comments at any time, and we hope you do. Now, let's turn to our book and guest for today. Christine Yu is an award-winning journalist whose work focuses on the intersection of health, sports science, and the needs and unique skills of women athletes. Her writing has appeared in Outside, The Washington Post, Runner's World, and other publications. She's a lifelong athlete who loves running, yoga, surfing, and skiing, and she lives in Brooklyn. Christine, welcome to this series.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this conversation.
So this is the first question that I ask everyone all the time, which is, tell us who you are, which is really a question of how did you come to write this book?
That's a really great question. I always say, I joke kind of that my agent told me to write this book. So,
Agents are
I've
good. Agents are good. I applaud that.
I've been a journalist for, over 10 years. I never thought I wanted to write a book. And my agent kind of kept prodding me. She's like, I think this is it. Like, I think this is the thing that, you should explore a little bit more. And it's in part because so much of the conversation that I've had through my reporting with experts in the field and with athletes themselves, um, there'd be these kind of side conversations about how, well, yeah, we don't actually know that much about women. We don't actually know that much about female physiology. And I'd be like, what are you talking about? This is back even in like 2017, 2018, so not terribly long ago. And it just sent me down this rabbit hole, really trying to understand and realize that, we've been neglecting women and female physiology in the fields of exercise physiology and sports science forever, essentially. And it really made me wonder, well, what does that mean when we don't study women to the same extent that we study men? How does that how does that influence who participates in sports? How does that influence our performance and our, potential for injury? And what does that actually mean for the long-term athletic lives of girls and women in sport? And so, yeah, I mean, my agent was right. Like, I shouldn't argue with her ever again. But this was the thing that I wanted to explore.
So you were coming to this, let's be clear, as an athlete yourself. I mean, as I referred to in that little bio I recited of you, you are a lifelong athlete, and you talk quite poignantly in the book about being injured as an athlete. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I will say I am an athlete, but I will also say preface it by saying I'm not a very good athlete. I grew up swimming and skiing, and I started playing organized sports in 4th grade, but it was one
Mhm.
of these things where it was more I loved playing with my friends. I loved spending times with them, and it was the idea that I could work at this thing and see myself get better and see that process of improvement. So sports and kind of being able to move my body has become a really important thing for me. It's the time and the place where I feel most grounded in myself. And it gives me that time and space, frankly, also away from my family and my kids, right? And, I can kind of think a little bit more clearly and be able to breathe a little bit more clearly too.
But in the process um, of pursuing that joy
Yeah.
that you get in athletics, you got injured, which is not uncommon for any
Yeah.
athlete, right? But it kind of it's. I have the sense in reading the beginning of the book that you were kind of haunted by your injury.
Yeah. So, in the beginning of the book, I talk about how I retore my ACL in my right knee. So I had torn it initially in college when I was skiing, and it was one of these things, right? Like, you have a bad wipeout. I mean, what can you do? Like, I tore my ACL, and then this time I was running at the track. I mean, of all things, I was doing some speed work, and I kind of just came around the bend and. I could feel my knee give away. I could feel it
Mm,
pop.
mm.
And it was one of these things where it was really frustrating because I felt like I had done all the things I was supposed to be doing, right? Like, was building up my base very gradually. I was strength training. I was doing yoga. I was doing, again, like all the things that I thought I should be doing. And it was this freak thing that happened where I mean, who tears their knee running? Who tears their ACL running? Like, you do it when you're skiing, when you're playing basketball, when you're playing
Mhm.
soccer. And even when I went to go see my orthopedic surgeon, he kind of looked at me and he's like, "Yeah, I don't know what to do with you, right?" Because I had other instances where yeah, he meant that. I mean, he's also kind of a friend of my sister too, so he can kind of speak to me in this way. But he meant that in the sense that I have what he said were like loose joints, right? Because several years earlier, I had dislocated my shoulder swimming.
Mm.
Again, one of these things where like, how do you even do that, right? How is that even like physically possible? But it was one of these things where I just felt really frustrated. Like, okay, I have these loose joints. What can I do about that? Like, that's my body. That's how it is. That's how it's built and what I'm working with. So, but what can I do in order to be able to continue doing the active things that I love, right? That are such a big part of my life and how I derive joy in my life.
So I want to be clear. The book is not a disease memoir. There have been other
No.
people who have been on this series who have written disease memoirs, and and those books have been fantastic. But I do think that what's interesting between the sort of genre of disease memoir and what you're describing is that a thing happened to you, you embodied it, and you went in search of an explanation. And as has happened with many other people I've spoken to over the course of this series, the explanation wasn't really there. Science wasn't helping you as a woman and an athlete to give you adequate answers for what was going on with your body.
Yeah. No, definitely. And it's funny because I also push back a lot on wanting to be included in in the book. Eventually, my editor had said, you know, I I think you got to be in there. I think you have
Mhm.
to be
Mhm.
this proxy for the reader for these questions that you're asking. Um, but yeah, it was one of these things where it really helped me understand a little bit better where I was coming from and how I was embodying a lot of these issues and how I was frankly processing it too, because
Mhm.
I feel like as I came through the process of reporting this and writing this, and by the end of it, I felt very differently about myself and my body and the injuries that I've had and all of that.
So you mentioned when we first started talking, and you talk about this in the book, about what and just extraordinary growth of women and girls doing athletics. There has been over, I don't know, the past couple of decades. The numbers are really phenomenal. More women are being and girls are being active. Women are playing their sports longer in their lives, and more women are excelling in
Mhm.
specific sports disciplines. But I got the sense in reading the book that all of this growth is in a way almost in defiance of the context, because it doesn't seem that sports science or biomedical research has actually been that helpful to women.
Yeah, it is really surprising. Like you said, over the last 50 years, I mean, frankly, since Title IX was passed, the growth in the number of girls and women participating in sports has skyrocketed. The opportunities for girls and women to participate and to compete is pretty phenomenal, and we've seen these athletes, just perform at a level that is really just amazing. I mean, you watch the NCAA women's basketball tournament, and these athletes are, I mean, on the court are just doing amazing things, right? But at the same time, the field of sports science and exercise physiology really hasn't kept pace with that growth of, this athletic population. So only 6% of sports science research really focuses exclusively on women. And that's looking at papers between 2014 and 2020. So
Hmm.
again, not very long ago. And that's such a small percentage. When they looked at the total number of participants, women only make up about a third of participants. So that means the vast majority of what we know about how the body responds to exercise, how we adapt to training, how we get injured, how we get better is all based on, predominantly male bodies and on men. And so, to your point, right, it is in a way that a bit of a defiance, right? That women are able to compete and to be able to perform at such a high level, despite not having guidelines or protocols that are really tailored to us, to our physiology, and to our lived experience. And it's also, frankly, in defiance too to, the historical notions of who could compete in sports, right? Who should be an athlete.
So we're going to get to that.
Yeah.
But I do just want to make the point that because this series is sponsored by Emory, and Emory is a
Mhm.
prominent research university with a medical school and a public health school and all sorts of other professional schools, that it's probably not news to
Yeah.
some portion of this audience that women have been underrepresented in biomedical research as both research subjects and also as researchers themselves.
Mhm.
Why? Why is that so?
Yeah, and it's funny because I also want to make the point too that I don't think it's malicious,
Hmm.
right, on anyone's part. It's not. I really hope, right? Like I doubt that it's any one scientist or any one institution that's saying no, we don't want to study women. Like it's not worth it. But I do think it has to do with the fact of how these systems of sports and scientific research were established from the beginning. And, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the sports history side of it, but, we all know sports was always been for and about men, right? That's who were the athletes. That's who should be competing in this arena. And so when scientists really began to study or are curious about how the body responds to things like exercise, it made sense that they would then turn to those people who were the athletes, which were men, right? And so when I ask a lot of these researchers about, why we understudy women, pretty much across the board, the answer they give me is, well, women are complicated. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? Right. Because again, I'm like, well, yes, everybody's complicated. But what they mean is that, you know, because with scientific research, especially when you're trying to understand like a mechanism or how a specific molecule or compound um, works or what its function is, um, you want to like eliminate as much extraneous variables as possible, right? You want to keep it pretty simple. And so the problem is with women is that, with our menstrual cycles, with our hormones fluctuate in the background throughout the month, and they fluctuate pretty, can be pretty dramatically, can be very unpredictable, can vary month to month, can vary across the lifespan. So it's a lot of noise in that data. And frankly, it takes time and money to account for that noise, right? To clear it out so that they can then interpret the data in a way to really understand what's going on. So in a way, it was a shortcut. It was
Mhm.
easier to study men because the hormones in their background don't fluctuate to the same extent as they do to women.
So I want to remind people who are watching that we would love to get questions from you. I'm not seeing any in the boxes yet. You can put them in at any time. At about 30 minutes through this experience, I will start posing questions to Christine if there are some. Um, so please think about what you're hearing. We'd love to hear your thoughts and your questions for her. So Christine, what I hear you saying, I think, is that science sort of assumed that women were just like men if you just carved out all the stuff that made them women, right?
Yes.
Uteruses and hormones and menstrual cycles and biomechanics, all of which we're going to talk about. But there was a point, but we've several times referred to the history, so let's go back to the history. And I was really struck. I mean, it's about to be the Olympics in Paris, and if I think I didn't really know that women were such recent entrants into the modern Olympic Games, or that they were, would have been considered completely inappropriate for them to participate in the life of sports at the point where the Olympics arose the first time. So let's talk a bit about, let's get into that history of how it was that sports was just not a thing, or athletics or exercise was not a thing that was considered appropriate, and how that persisted for a really long time.
Yeah, I think, for a long time, sports and athletics has been this realm for men to kind of display their masculinity, right? To appreciate the male form. And that's what like the ancient Olympics were. That's what it was in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Those were the people that were competing, the gladiators. Like you think about all of that, right? It's a very masculine situation going on. And so the concern was, even from the early days, the concern was is that eh, sports and vigorous activity like that could harm a woman's reproductive system,
Mm.
right? And given that essentially that's a woman's primary role in society and in the home was to bear children, anything that could potentially be seen as a threat to that was considered off limits, right? It considered inappropriate. And for lack of a better way of saying it, right? Like if you think about masculine, feminine, like, tropes and all of that, like the women were supposed to be seen as like, weaker and faint, dainty and like, all of these things that in comparison to these like big, bulky, athletic men. And that persisted. So when we get to the modern Olympics, women weren't allowed to compete in the first Olympics in I think it's 1896, and they were allowed to compete in the second Olympics in 1900. But out of the almost 1,000 athletes that were competing, I believe there were only 22 women athletes, and they
Mm.
were only allowed to participate in, I believe, again, like 5 sports. So again, it's a really circumscribed type of activity that women were allowed to compete in. It was like golf and things like that. Things again that weren't as super vigorous. But part of again these ideas that vigorous activity would sap women's energy, would, harm the menstrual cycle, would harm your reproductive system. All of these ideas, and because we weren't studying women at the same time, created really, like, frankly, a vacuum, right?
Mhm.
Where a lot of myths could start to take place or take root. So that's where we get things like your uterus is going to fall out if you run too far. Your ovaries might burst if you are too active, right? If you're due to, things that aren't appropriate. That there was one, I believe, New York Times reporter who said that women weren't as good swimmers as men because they have breasts, whereas men have pectoral muscles, right? So it's all
See.
of these ideas that aren't based in any sort of evidence or science because we never actually studied it. The funny thing is that there were some women physicians and scientists who were like took issue with this and were like, wait a second, like this is not right. Like I don't believe that the menstrual cycle inhibits us from being active. I don't believe that these things are a problem. And they went and studied it. This was like in the late 1800s, and they came back and they did scientific, research. They came back and they had all this evidence, and the men, again, who are in charge of the sports, who are in charge of the medical institutions, were like, "We don't believe your evidence. We
Hmm.
think you're too close to the topic because it has to do with women, right? You're too biased. So we're just going to kind of discard this." But these myths persisted for so long. Like women weren't allowed to run the marathon at the Olympics until 1984. Um, Women weren't allowed to compete in the ski jump at the Winter Olympics until 2014. That was only 10 years ago.
Just like too
And
big bang, everything might fall
too
through.
bad, yeah, it's the impact from landing from that big jump might make your uterus burst. Again, it's this idea that, you know, we don't study women, we don't take it seriously, and so we can allow for this bias to take root and for it to, to grow, right? And inhibit the ability of girls and women from taking part in these activities.
So, as I hear you speak, and as I read the book, the thing that struck me over and over again is the consistency of the pattern in which something goes wrong, whether women aren't allowed to exercise or to compete, and so they're not strong,
Mhm.
or they're injured, or in the modern context of running, they have stress fractures, or they're insufficiently nourished and they lose their periods. It's always the woman's fault.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
never the fault of the advice they've been given or the lack of science that is tailored to them, and it just seems very unfair.
Always the woman's fault. And I think it is in part, again, it goes back to this idea that sports was created for men, right? That's who is centered in this experience. And that's
Mhm.
what we've used as like the gold standard, the baseline that we measure everything against. And so when we think about girls, if you think about injury, for example, if men are the ultimate specimen to play sports, and if there are injury discrepancies between men and women, right? So say women, like with ACL tears, women have a higher rate of ACL tears. The typical model is to then compare men and women and be like, well, if women are getting injured more often, what's wrong with them? What's different from them in comparison to the men, right? And so it creates that mindset that you were talking about of this, like, women are deficient, they're defective, and it focuses in on the quote unquote problems, right? Of a woman's body, of her anatomy, of her physiology, or whatever it is. And it makes it her problem, something she's doing wrong. And even something as simple as, I've talked to a lot of women recently. I mean, we mentioned this behind the scenes too about sports bras recently, and about how when they were growing up as teens and adolescents, how they were made to feel like their developing body was the problem. So especially in, sports like dance or cheerleading or gymnastics, that as soon as their breasts started growing, like their instructors or coaches would make them feel bad that they couldn't, like, that they were doing a terrible job reining in their boobs, right? Or that God forbid their sports bra was showing underneath their leotard without, recognizing the fact that A, leotards offer zero, breast support, and B, this is the fact of their body, right? This is the fact of their maturing body, and it's not a problem. But yet, all of these girls are made to feel ashamed about what their bodies are going through, and it turned off so many people from sports.
So there's a thing that I think we ought to state before we get into the details of some of the science that you go through in the book, and that is that the point of your book and the point of this conversation is not to complain, right? I mean, I can imagine someone dismissing this as just whining. What you're writing about and what we're talking about is important because athletics is about excelling. And by giving women short shrift, sports has made it harder for them to excel. Sports is undercutting itself by keeping people from doing the very things that sports is for.
Yeah, and I mean, I would add to that too. It's not just sports in a competitive sense. I think it's physical activity in general and just being able to move our body in a way that feels good and comfortable, right? And we talk about so much about how, our culture and society, we're so sedentary now and how that's linked to all this disease, chronic disease, and all of these terrible things. But what are we doing really to not only help folks get involved in sports and physical activity, but how can we support them through that and help them continue to be active throughout their lifespan? So not just when they're young, not just when they're in their like quote unquote prime and like competing or something like that, but I think it's an important conversation for everyone.
So a thing that has been in my mind as I read the book, and you don't use this phrase in the book, but I'm going to lob it at you, is this question of sort of the beauty myth in our
Hmm.
society. The idea that whatever else they do, whether they excel in athletics or whether they excel in academics or they're brilliant performers, our culture sort of considers it the job of women to be attractive.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much that plays into suppressing women's ability to excel in sports. I think of girls I went to college with who had come out of essentially a major ballet company high school. And their
Hmm.
idea of lunch was an apple and a cigarette because that was the ballerina's diet, right? And keep staying unbelievably slender was the most important thing. I just wonder if you've had reflections about this.
Yeah, I think we put girls and women in such a hard spot, right? You're caught between a rock and a hard place. And because, on the one hand, we have these ideal athletes that we look up to, like we look up to and see like their bodies are, look like this, they're lean and they're sculpted and they're, for the most part probably thin as well, right? And then we think about like the popular athletes are most likely, conventionally attractive, um in that way as well, and it creates this idea that that's what you need to look like, that's what you need to be like in order to be a successful athlete. Whereas, body composition, frankly, sure, it does play a role in athletic performance, particularly in some sports like endurance related sports and stuff like that, but it's not the only factor. And yet I think we make it such a big point to focus on, in part because that's what we see, right? That's what we see with our eyes. That's what we can identify with. That's what, athletes themselves, we are admiring them because of the physical things that they're able to do with their body. So, I get why we focus on the body so much, but at the same time, it creates this narrative, and especially for girls and women who, we have to live up to such a high standard. Um, it can lead to creating these, very, not helpful and not healthy patterns, like you said. Restricting food and not eating enough, is a big piece of it. And, that can lead to so many different health problems down the line, like not only just eating disorders, but, it affects your bone health and it can lead to early onset osteoporosis and it can affect cardiovascular health and a whole range of things. But we're telling girls, on the one hand, we want you to compete, we want you to excel, we want you to do really well, but don't eat too much. Don't fuel your body. Don't give your body the thing that it actually needs in order for you to train well and to perform well. So it's again, it's this weird situation that these girls and women are caught. I mean, not just them, but I feel like every one of us is caught in with, within the diet culture that we swim within, right? That makes it extremely hard to be healthy and do the things that you need to do in order to move your body well and to keep it healthy.
So I'd like to talk for a bit about how research is turning
Yeah.
in women's favor for sports and exercise, and how investigators are starting to elucidate where these historic mistakes were made. And since we're talking about nutrition, it seems great to start with nutrition and this discovery that many female athletes are sort of chronically malnourished. You talk about the investigators who elucidated the I think it's the female athlete triad. Is that
Mhm.
right? I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because the female athlete triad is something that, kind of came to light back in the late 80s, early 90s, right? And it was at this time when, these researchers started noticing, and doctors also started noticing that, girls who were competing a lot, as well as professional athletes and Olympians, there was this weird thing going on where they tended to have, irregular or absent menstrual cycles, and they also seemed to have a lot of like bone stress injuries.
Mm.
So they were actually able to, do some studies and figure out that it's not the exercise that is causing the problem, but it was the fact that they were under fueling, they were under eating, they weren't eating enough, to support not only the activities of daily life, but to support their training, right? And so what's interesting, I think, about the female athlete triad is like, again, we've known about this for a long time, but it's kind of a little bit under the radar, right? Not a lot of girls and women knew about it. Not a lot of doctors knew about it. Not a lot of coaches knew about it. But it's really only been in the last, again, like 5, 10 years or so, where there's been a lot more attention on this issue of underfueling. And I think, and it's led to a lot more research across the world. It's now somewhat called relative energy deficiency in sport, and they've realized that it's not just bone issues and menstrual health that's affected, but it really affects essentially every system in the body, right? Like when you don't eat enough, it can create this cascade of physiological problems. But what's interesting is I think that the reason it's finally caught on is tied to the fact that there are so many more girls and women participating in sport on the one hand, right? There's a lot more people going through this, and that a lot of women who, may have started playing sports post Title IX, are now doctors and researchers, and they're still active themselves, and they're coming into senior positions in whether it's in the scientific institutions or, it's in policy positions or in funding positions or what have you, that they can actually make these decisions in terms of we want to fund more research on this. But I think like it's this combination of like we're finally at this moment where, we have this critical mass, we have the spotlight on women's sports, we have athletes, frankly, who are talking about this, which we never really did before. People wouldn't talk about it because, again, it was shameful. It
Mm.
was, assumed you had an eating disorder, which, yeah, you may or may not, but sometimes you end up in an underfueled situation just because you're busy. Like, I forget to eat because I'm like running after my kids or something like that. So it can be really unintentional, or it can be just by the by the nature of the fact that your training is ratcheting up. So it's really exciting to see kind of more attention to this, and the fact that people are recognizing that you do have to eat. Like if you want to do these things, like you have to fuel your body, you have to eat. It's kind of non-negotiable.
I think of the writer and substacker Casey Johnson, who writes the
Yeah.
newsletter "She's a Beast" about weightlifting, and especially sort of Olympic type weightlifting. And one of the things she says over and over again to people who are coming new to weightlifting is, "You're going to have to eat.
Yeah.
Whatever you're eating, it's not enough. You're just going to have to eat." And
Yeah.
I love that she's so. I mean, she's a very successful lifter, and she's built a beautiful coaching business
Mhm.
out of that. But that she is so uncompromising with people about, look, calories. You've been scared of them your whole life. If you want to lift, you're going to have to stop being scared. It's just very candid. It's great.
Yeah. It's hard. I mean, it is hard, right? There's so much unlearning that has to happen in terms of, you know, uh, like you said, just being afraid of eating certain types of foods or just being, or like eating X number of calories, or, I remember like growing up and seeing the magazines and them telling you basically like, you only need to eat 1,200 calories a day. I'm like, how do
Oh my
you
God,
function
yes.
on that?
Yeah,
Like for
exactly.
so long that had been like the thing in my head. I'm like, I can only eat 12 to 1,500 calories. I'm like, I don't understand how I survived.
So a couple of minutes ago, you talked about how now there is actually post Title IX, there's not only new generations of female athletes, but also some of them have grown up to become
Mhm.
female researchers. And so I'd like to talk for a couple of minutes about how those researchers are tackling some of the research challenges that you outline in the book, such as menstrual cycles are complicated. They're complicated for women as they go through them, and they're complicated as a scientific problem
Yeah.
because they change. Not only do they change over the course of the month, but they change month to month and year to year over the course of women's lives. And how do you find a I guess the word I want is homogeneous
Mhm.
research population when the subjects are so variable?
Yeah, and I think that that's the big challenge, right? Is like, I'm not sure you totally can, because everyone's hormone cycles and hormone ratios and all of that are so individual. But what I think is really exciting that a lot of these researchers do is they recognize that, right?
Mhm.
They, recognize this is the reality of this population that they want to research, and they know that it can be really intimidating for scientists who have not really done this, to figure out the methodology, right? To figure out how to check for menstrual cycle status and how to validate it. So, several of them have come together, and really like the best in the field, to put together these basically research protocols that define the terms, that, lay out like best practices in terms of how to validate menstrual cycle status in different populations. Again, creating like this common language across the field, which then, helps standardize things. So we then know that we're comparing apples to apples, right? And not comparing apples and oranges or something like that. Because I think that's also been a big problem in the past, is there has been there has been research that has involved like, the effect of menstrual cycle on sports performance and stuff like that. But oftentimes the quality has been low, or the methodology isn't standard across, so it makes it hard to compare the results from one paper to another. So they're trying to remedy that, and I think that's a huge service, to the research field overall.
So where in this new research that's happening, what particular bright spots do you see? Are there aspects of either topics like menstrual cycles or hormonal flows or biomechanics that are being opened up in new ways, or either athletes or investigators who you think are doing a particularly good job with this? What are the happy stories?
Yeah, there's so much. I feel like that's really exciting right now. On a couple of topics that I think is really great, is there's a lot more research going on around pregnancy and postpartum period, and trying to understand how to best get women back into sports. So, you know, as you probably know, there are no protocol currently no protocols on, exercise during pregnancy, or there are some on exercise during pregnancy, but the postpartum period is pretty much like, a black hole. There's nothing really there. So there's folks like Shefali Christopher and Rita Deering, who are putting together these protocols to help figure out like, okay, this is how we, step by step, this is how we get women back to sport. And primarily they're looking at like back to running, because since running is seems to be part of a lot of different sports that are played. So that's a really exciting piece of it. I think another exciting piece is really understanding all the advances that have happened with breast biomechanics over the years. So we haven't really studied breast biomechanics in depth since probably the early late 2000s, because we didn't have the technology for it. But now there are labs like the University of Portsmouth in the UK, who does all this incredible biomechanical testing on breasts to understand the complex movement, because breasts move in really complex ways. It's not just up and down, it's like up and down and side to side and in and out. And I mean, they described it to me almost as like this complicated figure eight butterfly pattern that happens. But you need to be able to study that in order to then design garments to support that movement and to support it in a comfortable way. So it's been really exciting to be able to see that, and to see that work being then incorporated by a lot of the athletic brands now, frankly. So those are two. And then there's just the last one that I'll just touch upon is around menopause. And as with everything, there's like no research on older women, and definitely not on older active women. But there are folks like Abby Smith Ryan, out of UNC, and her lab is doing a ton of work on menopause. And the thing with research, as you know, is that it can often take a really long time between when you do the studies and when it actually can be translated into clinical care. So they are, yes, doing kind of the basic science research and all of that, but they're also trying to do work that can be helpful now, right? And to be able to help women now at this point, because there are so many women, who are getting older, who are, just want answers and to understand like what is happening, both what is happening and like, how can I continue to perform and train at a level that I want to?
So, because we talked about breast biomechanics just a moment ago, I really want to hear you tell the story of the sports bra. I do want to point out we're getting a question from one of our listeners who wants to hear us talk about how sports will evolve in the next decade and how sports biomechanical research will also evolve and help guide that evolution. But I have to hear about sports bras first because, they make my life possible.
Yeah, I mean, right, as anyone who has breasts know, like they're kind of a non-negotiable if you want to be active in any sort of way. The sports bra wasn't invented until 1977. So up until that time, there was no garment, right? Like kind of back in the day, I believe like in the ancient times, like they would wrap like linen around their breasts, and like back in the early 1900s, there would be sports corsets, right? That women would wear, which again, they're still corsets. Like it's not very comfortable. So there were three women in Vermont. Mostly like two of them were runners. One of them was a costume designer, and they just got really frustrated. They're like, why can't I want to like they just started this woman had just started running. She wanted to figure out like how do I control my breasts? She had tried like wearing a bra that's too small, wearing two bras, going without a bra. And so she and her friends were kind of trying to figure this out. But then one day they were at her house and her husband waltzes down the stairs with his jock strap over his chest, right? Over one side of his chest. And he's like, "Look, ladies, like here's your jock bra," or something like that. And they're like laughing, thought it was hilarious. And this woman, Linda, jumped up and grabbed it from him and put it around her own chest. And she's laughing. And then she's like, "Wait a second. This actually, like, I think this actually feels okay." And so they went to the store, bought two jock straps, and basically sewed them together and created the prototype for what would become the jog bra. But it's one of these things where we never thought about the role of breasts in movement and how that might affect it. So we never studied it. And especially in a field like biomechanics, which tends to be even more male dominated than some of the other sports science fields, they never thought to study it.
So, first, I love that story. But also, what's so interesting about it is I feel like the jog bra, as it was called, which subsequently became the champion sports bra,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
It sort of opens the door into sports apparel, performance apparel,
Mhm.
really differentiating for women as opposed to
Yeah.
men, that women aren't just wearing, like getting a t-shirt and cutting the bottom 6 inches off because it's impeding their hips because it's so long, that the market actually starts to realize that that women need this and they're going to be willing to spend for it.
Yeah. And I mean, particularly with the sports bra, I think it really just opened the door for the ability for girls and women to be able to be active, right? And
Mhm.
then to your point, as we move on into the 80s and 90s, there are companies that start to realize, like, oh, like you said, wait a second, there's a market here we've been neglecting. But what's interesting is that they would then often take clothing and you know what they call shrink it and pink it, right? They would kind of
Mhm.
size it down a little bit, maybe like nip in the waist, put on like a little cap sleeve, like change the color a little bit, to make it more appealing to women. But in a lot of ways, it was almost just like, window dressing, right? It didn't actually take into account what women wanted or needed in order to be active. And sure, like, it probably works on a certain level, but as you kind of get up and as you become, more active, as you become like more proficient in your sport and more performance driven, you're going to want um, different apparel, different gear, all of those things. So it's really taken a while for things to kind of shift, from being just this kind of like window dressing, being like, hey, yeah, we have this section over here that's for women, to finally, I think, again, brands and companies recognizing that not only is this like a big market to serve, but that we deserve gear that really serves our needs.
So we have not probably about 10 minutes left, and it seems like a good time to ask you the question that our audience member Raja was posing, which is sort of what happens now. Where does sports biomechanical or biomedical sports research go in the future? And what I want to add into that question is, how does it broaden to people of color,
Mhm,
to people who are trans and non-binary,
mhm.
to take in the full universe of people who want to be active and athletic, who are not sort of the standard reference male.
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, if you think about it historically, yes, biomedical research has focused on men, but and especially within sports science and exercise physiology, it's a really pretty small sliver of even the male population, right?
Mhm.
It's a lot of these studies generally are done on college age men, who are in universities, frankly, because that, again, that's the population. They're right there. You can recruit them easily. So that's a pretty small sliver. So I think what we're starting to see is this recognition that we do need to broaden and we do need to diversify the participants that we're including in these studies and who we're studying. So yes, that's not only women, but it is people of color, it's people from non-Western countries, because again, a lot of the sports science research tends to happen in westernized countries and, in the US and Canada and Europe and Australia. But we need to broaden that because the more we study humans, a diverse population of humans, we get to learn more about human beings as a whole, right? We move away from just that tiny sliver of information that we have on a very specific population to having more information that can be applicable to a wider range of people across the globe.
So you mentioned when we first started talking that one of the many research gaps has been women as they're aging.
Mhm.
And I wonder if there's anything that you want to say about that, about how improved sports science can help people be athletes or can help people exercise as they move further into the life cycle. And for women, that would mean, in addition, getting past menopause.
Yeah, and I think for so long it's kind of assumed that, as soon as you get into middle age, it's your off ramp, right? Off ramp from doing all the big things, chasing big goals, being active in any way. And I get it because, I'm definitely there myself and, my time feels much more crunched. But at the same time, it's also this period of time where being physically active is almost more important, right? We start to get into age related muscle loss. We start to get into, especially with menopause and in the postmenopausal period, right, higher risk for cardiovascular disease. So it's really important that we continue to move and be able to move our bodies in a way that makes sense. And I feel like part of the problem why, or at least I'll speak for myself, part of my problem, with remaining physically active at this point is because my body feels different. It feels very different than it did from my 20s and 30s. And yet I, for a very long time continued to try to train in the same way as I did in my 20s and 30s. And it kind of felt like I was just banging my head against the wall. I'm like, why isn't this feeling better? Why aren't I improving? Why does this still stink so much? But it's recognizing the fact that, this perimenopause, postmenopause period, it's a period of transition. And again, it's a bookend to puberty in which our hormones again are like kind of crazy fluctuating and then they eventually decline. But with those changes in hormone levels, your body is literally changing physiologically, right? So that means that our bodies need different types of stimulus, different maybe nutritional support, maybe focusing more on recovery and sleep and all of those things that we could get away with when we were younger, but ignoring when we were younger. So I think the more information that we have, the better we can support women as we go into this middle age, like late, older age period, to be able to continue to be active.
So there's one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, and I didn't mean to leave it until the end, but it feels like a good thing to go out on. And a lot of so there's a kind of undercurrent, I think, in how people can think about this problem, which is that this problem of women being ignored by sports science, which is that women aren't going to be as good. Women are
Mm,
sort of like small men. We
mhm,
really need to research women because they're never going to perform at as
mhm.
high a rate. And yet you talk about athletes at one point in the book, ultra endurance athletes, where it's clear that women actually have an edge, that
Yeah.
their performance and their times and their stamina actually outshines men. And I would just love to hear you talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, it's been really amazing to see some of these athletes. So, right, these are athletes that are competing in distances. So, like in running, they're running like 50, 100, 200 miles, running for like 24 hours, 24, 48 hours straight, or swimming, around the island of Manhattan or across the English Channel multiple times. And they're just doing these incredible feats of endurance. Sometimes, oftentimes, not, yeah, sometimes, they're also winning races outright, right? So beating everyone in the field, including all the men in the field. And so it really, again, begs this question of what is it about women that allows them to be able to be successful at these types of events? Because I think, most people will agree and understand, right? There are sex differences between male and female bodies. And when you look at most records, say for running or, swimming or anything like that, there's about a 10 to 12% difference between the men's world record and the women's world record. But as distances get longer, that gap between, those times starts to narrow. And in some places, women start to come out ahead. And for me, the way that I think about it is that, as distances get longer, some of those physiological factors that may give men an edge, right? Like they have higher VO2 max, they have more muscle mass, like all of these things that might give men an edge start to wash out as you get longer distances, because it doesn't matter how fast you can run if like you can't problem solve on your feet, or you're so tired, or your stomach is like can't stomach food and you can't keep it down over the course of all of these distances. So I think like that physiological piece starts to wash out, while all these other factors where like women might have an edge start to creep up, right? And some of that might be psychological, or kind of the mental aspect of sport. Some of it might just be, there are some physiological advantages that women have when it does come to endurance sports. But it's really exciting to see. And I think to your point where, we always feel like women aren't going to be as good. Again, it goes back to this idea that like sports and the way we've thought about it has always been centered on men, and men have always been this benchmark. But women have never had really the opportunity to just go out there and perform without being compared to men, without having like the weight of the men's game, men's records, all of these things on their shoulder, right? So yeah, you can talk about basketball or whatever it is, and people will knock the women's game, but I think like the women's game, like we need to just be able to appreciate it for what it is and not always compare it to the men's game.
Well, considering what's happening in women's basketball right now, I think we can consider women a new benchmark. I
Yes.
like that thought. Christine, this was a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for coming and talking about your book.
Thank you so much for having me.
So that's it for this episode and this season of the Health Storytelling Author Q&A series. Please consider following Christina on social media. You can find her as CYU888, some very lucky numbers, on Twitter or X. on Threads and Instagram, and Christine Yu on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. And buy her book, which you can find at the site of her publisher, Penguin Random House, and at Amazon, of course, and at bookshop.org, which is the anti-Amazon. It's a B Corp, a social corporation for good, that will accept your order for the benefit of independent bookstores, which is a thing we love. If you actually like going to bookstores, we urge you to check out indiebound.com. That site will show you which independent bookstore near you is carrying her book or can order it for you. So this is it for the spring semester of the Health Storytelling Series at the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory. This academic year, we heard not only from Christine Yu, Teresa McPhail, and Jessie Singer, but also in the fall, Quinn Eastman, Jennifer London, and Amy Doxer Marcus. If you've missed any episode of this series, you can find them all archived on YouTube on the account of the Center for the Study of Human Health, where we have a playlist of all our interviews. So come back in the fall when we'll have an even larger slate of incredibly exciting authors talking about new books, about health, and the science of health. Until then, this series is hosted by the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University and co-sponsored by the Georgia Center for the Book, Science Gallery Atlanta, and the Decatur Book Festival. On behalf of all of our sponsors and from me, thank you for watching.